When I speak about 50 years to the Six-Day War or how the Middle East has changed, I must make one clarification to start, and that is not all that has happened in the 50 years is because of the Six-Day War. It all happened after the Six-Day War, that is true. But it's not the Six-Day War in and of itself that has created all these changes. One thing that is directly related to the Six-Day War, and again, it's not the war itself that caused the change, but more the war and the defeat of the Arabs in the humiliating way in which that defeat was inflicted upon them. I mean, just the name of the war is humiliating, the Six-Day War. The Arabs don't call the war the Six-Day War. The Arabs would say the June War or the 67 War. The Six-Day War comes from the Israeli side and from the friends of Israel, who, in a way, the name reflects the euphoria of the victory. The fact that it took 6 days was even compared to the 6 days of heavenly creation. And there were people, and this has important political ramifications in Israel to this day, who attach religious significance to the victory, which was very shocking to the Arabs, but also very surprising to the Israelis. I don't think too many people in Israel at that time thought that if there was to be a war, it would be over that soon and with such dramatic results in Israel's favor. This was completely unexpected. And one of the negative consequences of this surprising victory was that Israel entered into a period of euphoric self-assurance, exaggerated self-assurance, that it could do whatever it pleased, and the Arabs would never be able to cause Israel any serious damage. And 6 years later, in 1973, in the 1973 war, Israel paid a very heavy price for this exaggerated self-assurance. What was not caused by the war, but exposed by the war, was the dramatic failure of Arab nationalism. Many here will remember the heady days of Abdel Nasser, the 1950s and the 1960s, when Arab nationalism was even named after Abdel Nasser and called Nasserism, if you would remember. That Abdel Nasser was going to bowl over the Middle East, that Abdel Nasser was all-powerful, and that he had, and certainly the Arabs believed, that Nasser had the formula for victory. And not just victory over Israel, but victory over the West, turning the Arabs into a great international power. And the formula was composed of three things: Arab unity, what was then called Arab socialism, which meant communist-style economies, government-controlled economies, which were called Arab socialism, and an alliance in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And Nasser and the Arabs, generally speaking, really did believe that with Arab unity, Arab socialism, and an alliance with the Soviet Union, they would defeat Israel and establish the Arabs as a great power under the sun. Comes the Six-Day War and turns this huge dream into nothing in a week. That was devastating. I once was in a meeting which was part of the peacemaking efforts with Egypt, where we met with Egyptian former generals and intellectuals to talk about peacemaking and keeping the peace. This was after the peace treaty with Egypt. And in this discussion, I remember the Egyptians saying that you Israelis don't even begin to understand now, decades after 1967, how we, the Arabs, have not yet recovered from that defeat. You, the Israelis, don't fully recognize how deeply that war affected us, our self-image, our self-confidence. This great belief in Arab nationalism all of a sudden came to nothing. This vacuum was filled by two trends in the region, both of which are still very clearly apparent. Two trends, simultaneous but contradictory. One was the growing entrenchment of the belief in the independent Arab state. If Arab unity is a failure, then Egypt must look after Egypt. And Jordan must look after Jordan, and the Palestinians must look after Palestine. Each unto himself. What the French call raison d'etat, state interest. Not Arab unity, each state must look after itself. So raison d'etat, state interest, meant Egypt could make war with Israel or peace with Israel at any time of its choosing without asking any of the other Arab states to join or to agree. The end result of that was a war between Egypt and Israel in 1973, then peace between Egypt and Israel. And once Egypt, the largest and most powerful of Arab states, made peace with Israel, the Arab-Israeli conflict was over. Because the other Arab states can't fight Israel without Egypt. There is no Arab war option if Egypt doesn't fight. So once the Egyptians made their peace with Israel in the 1970s, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan couldn't possibly entertain the idea of making war with Israel. And Israel has not fought any war with an Arab state since 1973. Israel has not fought an interstate war with the Arabs for more than 40 years. And this has to do with the recognition of Egypt after 1967, and again after 1973, that Israel could not be defeated militarily, and that the cost of war with Israel for Egypt was prohibitive. If the Arab states are out of the conflict with Israel, that means if the Palestinians want to continue, it's their business. And the Palestinians, if they want to continue the struggle with Israel, they'll have to do it on their own. The Palestinians, after 1967, after the defeat of the Arab states, demonstrated a desire for their own independent struggle. They called it the independence of Palestinian decision. And the Arab states essentially said to them, you want an independent struggle? Be my guest. Do it on your own. And the Palestinians have been left out to dry since then. They have to face Israel, a very unequal competition, on their own. So this is the one phenomenon. The entrenchment of the Arab state and the belief in the priority of state interest. The second process that filled this vacuum, the contradictory process, is Islamic politics. Islamic politics, after all, is in contradiction to the state. The Islamists want to overthrow the state. So you can see across the board, from Morocco to the Gulf, how these two processes are at each other and have been since 1967. The Arab state versus the Islamists. In some cases, the Islamists have emerged victorious. In other cases, not. In the so-called Arab Spring, the Islamists nearly won in Egypt, but have since lost again to the state. But Islamic politics also means something else. Islamic politics means exacerbating internal religious divisions within Arab societies. Arabism, Arab nationalism, wanted to paper over all the sectarian differences, to say that all the Arabs, all who speak Arabic, whether they are Muslims or Christians, and doesn't matter what kind of Muslims, Sunnis or Shiis, or others who are breakaway from Islam like Alawis or Druze who once were Muslims and are not anymore. Doesn't matter what sect you are. Doesn't matter what religion you are. But if you speak Arabic, you're an Arab and you belong to the Arab nation. But if you speak about Islamism and not Arabism, Islamism means Islam, but who's Islam? Islamism separates between Sunnis and Shiis. Islamism separates between Muslims and Christians. Islamism breaks up the Arab state. And if you have multi-sectarian states, they are on the verge of disintegration. Look at Syria. Look at Iraq. They are no longer the unitary Arab states they once were in the name of Arabism. So Islamism, with all its advantages that it may have in some respects, is very, very divisive. And it is breaking up the Arab world, and you can see this before your eyes. One may ask, if Arab nationalism failed, why did the Arabs revert to religion? After all, they could have done something else. They could have become Marxists, or fascists, or some other ism. But they chose the return to religion. And the point to be made here is the power, the unexpected resilience of tradition. Tradition is much stronger in the Middle East amongst Jews also than people tend to believe. Zionists and other secular nationalists believed for generations that modernity would gradually override religion, and that religion would be shunted to the margins of politics and society. Well, that's not true. Didn't happen in Israel, and didn't happen in Turkey either. The Turkish Republic, secularized by General Ataturk, so famously the most secular of all Middle Eastern countries, now under Erdogan, is undergoing a religious revival. So the defeat with these emerging divisions exposed what one could easily call the decline of the Arabs, the failure of the Arabs to modernize successfully. That's why they lost. And they lost in 1967 primarily because Israel did succeed to modernize successfully, and still succeeds to do so. And the Arab states have not done so. And perhaps the most troubling aspect of this failure to modernize successfully is represented in Arab societies by something which you may not recognize to be that critical and important. It is the lack of gender equality. The lack of gender equality. Now, you may think that gender equality is something that you have to talk about because it's politically correct to talk about gender equality, so you speak about gender equality. But gender equality is about economics. If women are marginalized from the education system, if women are marginalized from the workforce, what you have are economies, let's say like Egypt, where half the population, women, don't work because they're in the home in the name of tradition. Women who have low levels of education and who do not work also become mothers of large families. So you have this catastrophic combination in various Arab countries of poorly performing economies because of the very low participation of women in the workforce, rapidly growing populations because of the large families they have. And you don't have to be an economist to realize that if you have poorly performing economies with rapidly growing populations, you're going to have a disaster on your hands. Well, this is not a prediction. We're in the disaster now. This is the disaster. The population figures are stunning. In the year 2000, the population of all the Arab countries combined was 280 million. It's now 380 million. And in the 2020s, it will be 460 million. Who is going to provide for these people? There can be no way in which there will be provision for this amount of people. And they will continue to emigrate. The Syrian civil war, which has caused massive emigration, is just an added factor. Even if the Syrian civil war were to end in next month, the continued migration from the Middle East would continue because the region cannot sustain its population. That is the cause of what was called the Arab Spring. The massive uprisings of the younger generation who have no future ahead of them. This is what a professor of history at UCLA called the waithood generation. Those people who go through childhood, and then boyhood, and come to 18, 19, to waithood, waiting for something good to happen, to get a decent education, to get a decent job. And for that group, huge, relatively speaking, in number, of 18 to 30, there is this hopelessness that awaits them, and therefore the revolutions and instability that have characterized the Arab states over the last few years. People now speak of the Arab human disaster reports. Millions of refugees. The collapse, if you take a country like Syria or like Iraq, the collapse of state systems, education, economy, health, all of these no longer functioning. People in Syria have been seen trying to sell their children to escape this horrific poverty that now strikes them. So you can see this in countries like Syria and Iraq falling apart at the seams. And then you look at a country like Jordan, next door to Israel. Jordan, which was always spoken of, and I'm sure many of you have heard this many times, Jordan is bound to disappear. Jordan is an artificial creation. It can't possibly last. Well, Jordan has been there for nearly 100 years. And it's probably the most stable country in this part of the Middle East. And the question is, why is that so? Jordan started off virtually with nothing, the desert, and a few 100,000 people. Jordan now has a population more or less equal to that of Israel, about 8 million. But Jordan has the same regime that it has had since 1921, the Hashemite monarchy, which has not been overthrown despite all the challenges and the refugees and the economic difficulties and everything else. The reason, I would argue, is because Jordan, in terms of religious composition, is united. The Jordanians are over 90% Sunni Muslims. Not like Iraq and Syria or Lebanon, that are made up of a mosaic of minorities, Sunnis and Shiis and Kurds and Arabs. Now one may say, wait a second, Jordan is half Palestinian, isn't it? True. The Palestinians are about half the population in Jordan, perhaps a little bit more than half. But Palestinianness and Jordanianness are relatively novel identities. They've just emerged in the last half century, more or less, and you can't compare them with the differences between Muslims and Christians or between Sunnis and Shiis, which go back to the 7th century and before. So the distinction between Jordanians and Palestinians in terms of their modern nationality is far less important in this day and age of sectarianism, that they all belong to the same religious sect. And in that sense, Jordan is far more united and therefore far more stable than all of its neighbors that were thought to be for decades much more serious countries. And talking about Jordan brings me to the Arab-Israeli conflict and what we have since 1967. First of all, the war in 1967 reinforced a phenomenon which was already in existence as of 1948, and that is Israel as a living monument to Arab inadequacy. Israel stands there as a monument to Arab failure. This was true in 1948, and in 1967 even more so. On the one hand, needless to say, and quite understandably, this is cause for huge Arab resentment. Israel is resented for its success. Resented for its success at the expense of the Arabs. So on the one hand, you have this sense of resentment, but on the other hand, you also have a rather realistic, pragmatic recognition of Israel's power. So this is how we arrive at the kind of peace we have with Egypt, or the peace we have with Jordan, or the effort that didn't work to make peace with the Palestinians, where on the one hand, you have the recognition of the need to make peace with Israel. But on the other hand, there's resentment towards Israel. So peace does not do away with the resentment. Peace puts an end to the armed conflict, but the resentment remains. And therefore the problematic relationship that Israel has with Egypt or with Jordan, even though it's peace. Peace meaning no more war, but not necessarily the kind of warm peace that the Israelis would have wanted. That is a peace which isn't only the end of war, but also the acceptance of Israel's legitimacy. And that you don't have. It's not war anymore, but Israel is not embraced by the neighborhood as a legitimate member of the family of Middle Eastern nations. 1967 is also the return of the Palestinians. From 1948 until 1967, the Palestinians were on the margins of Middle Eastern politics. The conflict in those days was called the Arab-Israeli conflict. Nobody even mentioned the Palestinians. It was about the conflict between Israel and the neighboring Arab states. Those Arab states that went to war with Israel in 1948, and those are the Arab states that Israel negotiated armistice agreements with after 1948. After 1948, Israel didn't even talk to the Palestinians. And the Palestinians ceased to be an independent factor in Middle Eastern politics. This area of the West Bank, which Israel did not take in 1948, and the Gaza Strip, which Israel didn't take either. Gaza was under Egyptian military administration. The West Bank was annexed to Jordan. So there were no Palestinians, not in the political sense. There was no place on the map called Palestine. The West Bank wasn't even called by the Jordanians Palestine. The Jordanians could have called the West Bank Palestine. But they deliberately chose to call it the West Bank, not Palestine, because the Jordanians had no interest in the preservation of the Palestinian identity. So the term West Bank, which now everybody uses without thinking twice, is actually an anti-Palestinian term. It was a term invented to erase Palestine from the map. But when Jordan lost the West Bank in 1967, the Israelis could not have realized what in fact they were doing. But by bringing an end to Jordanian control of the West Bank, Israel put an end to the process whereby the Jordanians were Jordanizing Palestine. The Jordanians were incorporating the Palestinians as Jordanian citizens, turning the West Bank into a part of the Jordanian kingdom. That process was halted by the war in 1967. And once the process of Jordanization was halted, the process of Palestinization was accelerated. Not Israel's intention, but war is almost always a story of the unintended consequences. There's some gentlemen in this country should think about that too. But that's not my business. The Palestinians, after 67, thought that they could, from Jordan, wage a war of liberation against Israel, like the Algerians waged against the French in Algeria. But the Palestinians made a poor comparison. The Jews in Israel are not the French in Algeria. The French in Algeria, if things really get bad, can pack up and go back to France. The Israelis are not going to pack up and go anywhere. And the Jordanians could no longer afford having the Palestinians fight against Israel from their territory, with the Jordanians paying the price of Israeli retaliation. And the end of that story is the famous Black September civil war of 1970, when the Jordanians crushed the Palestinians. And that essentially was the end of the Palestinian armed struggle against Israel. Not that the Palestinians didn't continue to fight against Israel, and they still do. But by military means, to defeat Israel is something the Palestinians are not capable of. The war option of the Arabs, as we have seen, was already over. Israel, therefore, could in 1982 put an end to the last independent Palestinian zone of operations, which was then in Lebanon. Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982. The Arab states all watched as Israel crushed the PLO. Not one single Arab state lifted a finger. The war in Lebanon, strangely enough, talking about unintended consequences, led eventually to the Oslo peace process. Now that may seem very odd. The people who launched the war in Lebanon in 1982, the Israeli right, didn't have the slightest intention of arriving at Oslo. By destroying the PLO in Lebanon, they sought to take the West Bank for Israel. But what actually happened was, having destroyed the PLO in Lebanon, the West Bank became the center of Palestinian politics. And the West Bank rose against Israel in the first Palestinian uprising in 1987. Israel, after the first Palestinian uprising, began to think maybe of coming to terms with the Palestinians. And with the Palestinians having been kicked out of Lebanon, the Palestinians were ready to talk to Israel too. Thus, we arrive at Oslo. Oslo was waged by the Israeli left, which was against the war in Lebanon. But had it not been for the war in Lebanon, there would have been no Oslo. So the people who carried out Oslo were against the war in Lebanon, which was carried out by the right, who had no intention of arriving at Oslo. But that's the way it worked out. So we have a process with the Palestinians based on the famous UN resolution 242. Here I must explain a little about this very famous Security Council resolution. Security Council Resolution 242 came into being in November 1967 as a result of the war in 1967. Resolution 242 is that resolution which invented the formula land for peace. Israel gives up land that it took in the war in exchange for peace. That is, many people speak about Israel's illegal occupation of the West Bank. You can be for or against the occupation. I personally am not a great fan of the Israeli occupation. But it's legal. It's not illegal. The Security Council resolution of November 1967 demands that Israel withdraw from territories occupied, not from all of them necessarily, in exchange for peace. That is, it's not an unconditional withdrawal. The UN could have said, Israel has occupied these territories by force and must withdraw immediately. But it never said so. And it linked the withdrawal, if there was to be one, with peace. The Arabs must make peace for Israel to withdraw. And why did the UN take that position? After all, the UN would never support the occupation by force of territory. Israel's war of 1967 was seen as a war of self-defense. Israel was seen by the international community to have been right. It appeared as if the Arab states were ganging up on Israel in May, June 67 to crush Israel, to throw the Jews into the sea, as Arab leaders were saying. And there was great fear in the international community that that would really happen. And there was fear in Israel too. This is still the generation of the Holocaust who are still around in Israel, rushing to the supermarkets to buy supplies just in case. And there was talk of a second Holocaust. There were those, even experts, who advised the government to dig thousands of graves in preparation for the thousands of Israelis who would be killed in air raids from Egypt. And thousands of graves indeed were dug around Tel Aviv in preparation for the huge losses Israel was going to suffer. And that is why the war, as it ended, was such a great relief. But this gives rise to another question, which comes to the fore in Israel after 1967. What is Israel all about? What is Zionism all about? Classical Zionism, like the war in 1967, is a story of Jewish self-defense. Classical Zionism is understood to be the salvation of the Jewish people from destruction, the rise from the ashes of 1945 to independence and sovereignty in 1948, justice for the downtrodden of the earth, The world could not just sit back and ignore it. And the world, generally speaking, supported. There was a great justice in this victory of the Jews. But international legitimacy for Israel was always based on two things. The perception of Israel as a project of self-defense, and as part of that, the acceptance of the idea of partition. That is, two states in Palestine. Israel was created in the name of a UN resolution in 1947 that partitioned Palestine into two states. So legitimacy for Israel was about two things: self-defense and partition. 242 is about self-defense and partition. And Arab states, important Arab states, after 1967, Egypt and Jordan, accepted Resolution 242. That is, they were willing to make peace with Israel on the basis of an Israeli withdrawal, as they would see it, from all the territories taken in 1967. But that was progress. They were now accepting two states. That is, some kind of partition of Palestine between Israel and some other Arab party, Palestinians, Jordan, whoever. The PLO never accepted 242 until 1988. And the PLO never accepted Resolution 242 because Resolution 242 never even spoke about the Palestinians. Didn't even mention the Palestinians. As far as Resolution 242 was concerned, Israel was supposed to return the West Bank to Jordan. And here, one must point to a major difference between the Arab states on the one hand and the Palestinians on the other. The Arab states, like Egypt and Jordan, could accept Resolution 242. Because Resolution 242 spoke about 1967. Israel should withdraw from the territories it took in 1967. The Arab states have 1967 problems with Israel. But the Palestinians don't only have 1967 problems with Israel. The Palestinians have 1948 problems with Israel. And therefore, for them to accept Resolution 242 was unacceptable. But then rose in Israel a new form, a new interpretation of the Zionist idea. What I call settlerist neo-Zionism. The settlement project is not about self-defense. The settlement project is in the name of messianic religious redemption. And it is not in favor of partition. So the settlement project is actually at odds with what had been the foundation of Israeli international legitimacy until 1967. And here Israel clashes with the international consensus. The last example is the speech made by Secretary Kerry in December of 2016, immediately after the UN resolution, Resolution 2334, that condemned Israel and the settlement project. But what did Kerry say? The Kerry speech, like the UN resolution, rejects the settlement project. But it actually endorses Israel of pre-67. It does not condemn Israel of pre-67. It does not erode Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. It does not question Israel's control of 78% of historical Palestine. Now that's progress. Because before 1967, the international community expected Israel to give up parts of the Negev for peace with the Arabs. That is, the boundaries we had until 1967 were not accepted internationally and were often questioned. But since 1967, nobody questions those boundaries. We get very upset when they tell us that we should return to those boundaries. But actually, the fact that the international community doesn't question those boundaries at all, that Israel, the nation-state of the Jewish people, has 78% of historical Palestine, we should be quite happy with that measure of international endorsement of the Zionist project. The resolution that Kerry was speaking about calls upon all states to distinguish in their relevant dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967. So the problem is not Israel before 67. The problem is post-67. That's where the international consensus establishes the contours of the two-state solution. And if you look at Kerry's speech, Kerry, like the rest of the international community, is against Israel on all the 1967 questions. That is, Jerusalem must be redivided, settlements are illegal, and Israel must withdraw more or less to the 67 boundaries. That's the Palestinian position. But the Palestinians have another point, and that is from the 1948 questions, and that is refugee return to Israel. And on that, not Kerry, nor anyone else in the international community, nor the UN resolution supports the Palestinians. They support Israel. There is no international support for the Palestinian idea of the right of return. That is, if you separate between the 1948 file and the 1967 file, the world is with Israel on the 1948 issues. That is, with original Israel and the concept of partition, but not with Israel post-67 settlements and not the acceptance of two states. In the meantime, the region has changed dramatically. Our founding fathers, Ben-Gurion and his generation, were a pessimistic lot. And I would think had good reason. They saw the Holocaust. They saw Israel scraped through in 1948 by the skin of its teeth. Ben-Gurion, after the victory in 1948, wrote in his diary, "The fact that we won in 1948," he wrote, "is no indication of the future. What will be in the future?" He was very, very worried and concerned. And in fact, Ben-Gurion believed that the Arab states would modernize, would become more and more powerful, aligned with the Soviet Union, would build a massive conventional military machine that Israel would not be able to face. So Israel went nuclear. That's why we did it. Israel doesn't admit having gone nuclear, but every Tom, Dick, and Harry knows. And we just let it be. But that's not how the Arab world worked out. As opposed to Ben-Gurion's pessimistic assumptions, the Arab world did not get stronger and stronger. The Arab world actually got weaker and weaker. And Israel got stronger and stronger. And Israel is now much more powerful than the Arab neighborhood, with or without nuclear weapons. And the world around us, this Arab world, which is now much weaker, is also less hostile to Israel. With the Arabs in decline, there are other Middle Eastern powers to worry about. The non-Arab powers, Iran and Turkey. And Iran is Israel's great worry, not the Arab states. But for the Arab states, Iran is also their great worry. So Israel and the Arab states now have a common cause, a common enemy. And Israel and some key Arab states like Egypt and Jordan have very high-level cooperation on all sorts of issues, even on intelligence. The tension in the Arab world between Sunnah and Shia, between the Arabs and the Shia, who are the Iranians, puts Israel and the Sunnis on the same side of the divide. So we are not alone anymore. It's not we against all the rest, as it used to be. There are other issues, other states, part of our world with whom we have perhaps greater common cultural association than with countries like Iraq or Syria. Israel has ever closer ties with Greece, with Cyprus, with Bulgaria. The countries of the Eastern Mediterranean, the non-Arab countries of the Eastern Mediterranean, have relations with Israel that are of strategic consequence in some fields, like gas, like military training. Israel trains its forces in Cyprus and in Greece, even in Crete. And the reason why we train there is because there's territory like in Lebanon. So we practice there for the possibility that we may have to fight Hezbollah in similar terrain. But this is an indication of the closeness and the intimacy of Israel's relations with countries that we weren't that close to in the past. But that Israel probably has more in common with countries like Greece and Cyprus than it would have with countries like Iraq and Syria. And the main problems come from Iran, as the Arabs are so weak. And the weak Arab states give place to the non-state actors. Because the states are weak, the non-state actors can play. Hezbollah and ISIS and company. So when we look at these realities, what are Israel's options? What is it that we should actually do? And here, it's, needless to say, rather complicated, a kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. Can Israel withdraw from the West Bank? We withdrew from Gaza unilaterally, and peace didn't follow. The rockets followed. So Israelis would now argue, why should we do that again? Withdraw from the West Bank and have the rockets follow from there too. There are those in Israel who say, let's act unilaterally and annex those parts of the West Bank that we would like. That would make Israel more secure and annex something like 60% of the West Bank and leave the 40% of the West Bank for the Arabs. But if you do the math, if Israel takes 60% of the West Bank, altogether of historical Palestine, it makes Israel shift up from 78% to 90% and leaves the Arabs with 10%. I don't see any possibility that Israel can take over 90% of historical Palestine and leave a sliver of 10% for the Palestinians. But that wouldn't pass, I would think, in the courts of international public opinion. I don't think even many Israelis would be willing to indulge in that kind of operation. So Israel is in a dilemma. If you leave things as they are, then Israel is on the wrong side of the international community. But worse than that, I would argue, Israel's on the wrong side of its own long-term future. If Israel remains in occupation of the West Bank forever, Israel is creating not a two-state solution, not a two-state reality, but a one-state reality. One state in which the Jews will eventually become the minority. So what's the point in the exercise? What point is there for the Jews in Palestine, Eretz Israel, to become the minority? I mean, after all, why did we do what we've just done? The reason why Israel is there is for the Jews to be a majority, and to be a decisive majority, and to exercise the right to self-determination. So it's a hard call. On the one hand, Israel's legitimacy, Israel's Jewishness, and on the other hand, the security problems that are posed by the inability of the Israelis and the Palestinians to agree on what these two states ought to look like. Israelis and Palestinians may, in theory, agree on a two-state solution. But if you ask Israelis what a two-state solution should look like, and you ask Palestinians what a two-state solution should look like, they're not talking about the same playing field at all. So we, 50 years after 1967, may be more powerful than Israel has ever been, are nevertheless facing the existential dilemmas that have accompanied the Zionist project ever since the very beginning. Thank you.